The Laundering, Case 12, The White Coat. 4 episodes in the renting of medical authority. 1 instrument, 80 years. Walk me in.
A long arc case study in credential laundering. 4 episodes. Episode 1. From 1946 to 1952, the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company runs the More Doctors Smoke Camels campaign in the Journal of the American Medical Association, in the New England Journal of Medicine, and on prime time radio. Episode 2. In January 1980, a 5-sentence letter in the New England Journal concludes that addiction is rare among hospitalized patients given narcotics. Over the next 2 decades, that letter is cited more than 600 times, frequently in ways that omit the hospital setting, and is used by Purdue Pharma to train its OxyContin sales force.
2 more episodes.
Episode 3. Between 2008 and 2020, 3 patients in 3 Canadian provinces die in hospitals after care that the operating institutions later acknowledge was inadequate. Brian Sinclair, Anishinaabe, in Winnipeg in 2008. Joyce Echequan, Atikamek, in Joliet in 2020. Samuel Uko, a black refugee from what is now South Sudan, in Regina in 2020. The first 2 were Indigenous. The third was black. Coerced sterilizations of Indigenous women in Saskatchewan hospitals are documented as recent as 2018. Episode 4. From April 2023 to the present, Canadian provincial health authorities and medical regulators, with isolated exceptions, decline to maintain universal masking in healthcare settings, while immunocompromised patients continue to report being unable to access care safely.
4 episodes. What unites them?
The credentialed voice of the physician was, in each, lent to a policy the available evidence did not support. Case 01 examined a university degree. Case 09 examined the inquest. Case 12 examines at the level of the profession, rather than the institution, the instrument all of those cases touch, but none isolate: the credential itself. The vocabulary carries over: placement, layering, integration. What varies is the substrate. In Case 12, the substrate is the white coat.
Section 1. 4 episodes briefly. Start with tobacco.
Episode 1. 1937 to 1953, United States. From the 1930s, cigarette advertisements appear regularly in major medical journals: JAMA, the New England Journal of Medicine, The Lancet, the British Medical Journal. In 1946, R.J. Reynolds launches the More Doctors Smoke Camels campaign on the strength of a survey of 113,597 physicians whose methodology was not disclosed and whose respondents had reportedly been sent free cartons of camels prior to the survey. The campaign runs in some form until 1952. Camel advertisements appear in the New England Journal as late as January 1950.
In the American Medical Association,
R.J. Reynolds maintained a medical relations division. The AMA declined, during the campaign's run, to take a position on smoking and health. The AMA's own investment portfolio held tobacco stocks into a later period. The 1964 U.S. Surgeon General's report on smoking and health was not produced by, and was not led by, organized American medicine. What the credential supplied was the visual and rhetorical authority of the physician, lent to a product whose harm was, by the end of the campaign's run, increasingly documented in the same journals carrying the advertisements.
Episode 2. Opioids.
1980 to 2007, United States and Canada. On the 10th of January 1980, the New England Journal published a 5-sentence letter to the editor by Jane Porter and Herschel Jick, titled "Addiction Rare in Patients Treated with Narcotics." The letter reported that among 11,882 hospitalized patients who had received at least one narcotic preparation, the authors found only 4 cases of reasonably well-documented addiction in patients who had no history of addiction. It was a short observation, not a study.
And what happened to it?
Over the following 37 years, it was cited more than 600 times in scholarly papers. A 2017 review by Pamela Leung and colleagues, published in the same journal, found that of 608 citations examined, 439 cited the letter as evidence that addiction was rare in patients treated with opioids, and 491 failed to mention that the patients in the original letter had been hospitalized. The most consequential citation was Russell Portnoy and Kathy Foley's 1986 paper In Pain. A 1996 landmark consensus, co-authored by Portnoy, cited the less than 1% addiction figure. Purdue Pharma trained its OxyContin sales representatives to tell physicians that the risk of addiction among patients using the drug was less than 1%, citing Porter and Jick.
And the authors?
Portnoy later acknowledged that the papers cited in support of liberal prescribing represented no real evidence and that the goal of the literature had been to destigmatize opioids. Quote, "And because the primary goal was to destigmatize, we often left evidence behind." Herschel Jick has said, on the public record, that he is, quote, "essentially mortified that the letter was used in the way it was used. What the credential supplied was the academic citation chain. The shape of the chain was supplied by organized academic medicine. The prescribing physician was at the front of the chain. Purdue was behind it."
Episode 3, 2001 to 2020.
Canada, Indigenous and Black patients. Between 2005 and 2010, the Saskatoon Health Region operated a postpartum tubal ligation policy, under which Indigenous women have said, on the public record, that they were coerced into signing consent forms during or immediately after labor. A 2017 external review by Senator Yvonne Boyer and Dr. Judith Bartlett documented the pattern in the Saskatoon Health Region. The Saskatoon Health Region apologized. A class action lawsuit was filed in 2017 and has since grown to approximately 100 plaintiffs alleging coerced sterilizations between 1970 and 2018. Senator Boyer has estimated that at least 12,000 women have been affected since the 1970s.
And the 3 deaths?
Brian Sinclair, Anishinaabe, in Winnipeg in 2008. Joyce Echequan, Atikamekw, in Joliet in 2020. Samuel Uko, a black refugee from what is now South Sudan, in Regina in 2020. The first 2 were Indigenous. The third was black. Each involved a Canadian hospital and the operational conduct of physicians, nurses, and security staff working under the credentials and authority of their respective provincial colleges. In none of the 3 cases did the relevant Provincial College of Physicians and Surgeons strip the license of any physician on grounds of racism as a contributing factor. In each case, the operating health authority retained its institutional standing. The substantive question of whether systemic racism in Canadian healthcare contributed to the deaths is, on the formal state record, answered as follows. By Manitoba, no formal finding. By Quebec, yes, with the finding refused by the provincial government. By Saskatchewan, no formal finding, Question distributed forward across training. Episode 4. COVID. 2023 to the present. Canada. COVID in healthcare settings. In April 2023, British Columbia and Saskatchewan became the latest Canadian provinces to lift universal masking mandates in healthcare settings. By that date, the majority of Canadian healthcare facilities had already dropped their mandates. The policy shift was led at the provincial level by chief medical officers of health and provincial health authorities, ratified, in the sense of not being contested, by the provincial colleges of physicians and surgeons, and absorbed by the Canadian Medical Association without sustained institutional opposition.
And the underlying transmission
Continued. Independent surveillance, including wastewater monitoring, recorded substantial COVID transmission through the 2023 to 24 and 2024 to 25 winters. The winter of 2023 to 24 was the second highest peak of U.S. transmission to that point. Healthcare-acquired COVID infection in patients admitted for unrelated reasons has continued to be documented. Immunocompromised and disabled patients have continued to report being unable to access necessary care safely. Physicians who advocated for the restoration of universal masking, Dr. Neely Kaplan-Murth in Ottawa most prominently, have faced sustained professional and public pushback, including harassment and complaints processes. What the credential supplied was cover for a policy choice made on operational and economic grounds. The medical authority was supplied to a policy whose primary determinants were not medical.
Section 2. The comparison. 1 instrument, 4 episodes. Walk the table. 5 rows. Row 1. Instrument of the credential. Tobacco. Direct paid advertising in medical journals. Staged physician imagery in mass media. AMA collaboration with industry research. Opioids. A citation chain anchored in a 5-sentence New England Journal letter. CME paid by the manufacturer, the key opinion leader system, sales training citing the academic literature. Indigenous and Black patients in Canadian healthcare, operational practice under provincial college-administered licenses. Institutional policy, including the Saskatoon tubal ligation policy, emergency room and triage practice as ordinary clinical conduct. COVID, endorsement by provincial chief medical officers of health, non-contestation by provincial colleges and the Canadian Medical Association, college complaints applied asymmetrically. Row 2. Was the evidence contested at the time? Yes, in all 4. For tobacco, Dolan Hill 1950 in the British Medical Journal, Winder and Graham 1950 in JAMA. The link between smoking and cancer was being established in the same journals that carried the Camel advertisements. For opioids, multiple addiction medicine specialists questioned the Portnoy framework. The forcing function arrived only with the overdose data of the 2000s. For Indigenous and Black patients in Canadian healthcare, Indigenous-led advocacy, Shireen Razak's work, the Brian Sinclair Working Group, McCallum and Perry, and the BC in Plain Sight report all named the structural pattern for Indigenous patients. For Black patients in Canadian healthcare, the UCO inquest, documented in Case 09, is on the record. Alongside a longer-standing scholarly literature, this case does not substitute for. For COVID, aerosol transmission science is settled. Hospital-acquired infection rates are documented. Immunocompromised patient advocacy is sustained. The college position is not. Row 3. Who paid for the credential's use? Tobacco companies, directly R.J. Reynolds
maintained a medical relations division. Pharmaceutical manufacturers, principally Purdue Pharma. For episodes 3 and 4, no external private payer is required. Provincial governments, as funders of health authorities, and the operational interest of the institutions themselves. The institution defaults to its operational interest. No outside money is required for that default to operate.
Row 4. External forcing function that broke the consensus.
The 1964 U.S. Surgeon General's report for tobacco, external to organized medicine. The overdose mortality data of the 2000s and 2010s, plus the CDC's 2016 prescribing guidelines, plus the Sackler civil and criminal proceedings for opioids, external, in significant part, to organized academic medicine. For Indigenous and Black patients in Canadian healthcare, and for COVID, the consensus has not, on the formal state record, been broken. Quebec named systemic racism. The Premier refused. The colleges have not acted at the license level. Universal masking in healthcare has not been restored by any major Canadian college or chief medical officer of health.
Row 5. Time elapsed before formal correction.
Tobacco. Approximately 30-plus years from campaign launch to AMA condemnation. Opioids. Approximately 25 years from Portnoy and Foley to the New England Journal's published reckoning. Indigenous and Black patients in Canadian healthcare and COVID. Ongoing. No formal state correction has been issued in either case.
Section 3. The architecture. The credential as a rentable instrument.
The 4 episodes are not united by a shared cause. Tobacco's advertising apparatus and the operational policy of a Canadian provincial health authority during a respiratory pandemic have no common funder, no common motive, no common adversary. What unites them is the shape of the instrument the credential constitutes when the profession's regulatory architecture defaults to non-contestation. 4 positions of the credentialed voice. Position 1. The advertised endorsement. The physician's image, voice, or stated preference is sold to a third-party product. The advertisement is the instrument.
Position 2.
The citation chain. The credentialed literature is composed in a way that supports a marketing claim downstream. Letters, small case series, key opinion leader papers, consensus statements. The footnote is the instrument.
Position 3.
The operational default. The credentialed institution's day-to-day operating practice, triage, consent, discharge, security, produces the harm without any single decision being identifiable as the cause. The standard of care is the instrument.
Position 4.
The institutional endorsement. The credentialed body's public position, a chief medical officer announcement, a college's silence on a contested clinical question, a Canadian Medical Association non-statement, supplies cover for an operational decision whose primary determinants are not clinical. The endorsement is the instrument. Tobacco operated principally through position 1. Opioids through position 2. The treatment of Indigenous and Black patients in Canadian healthcare through position 3. COVID in Canadian healthcare from 2023 through position 4. The same credential supplies all 4.
What is the instrument doing?
Making a position seem medical when the position is operational, commercial, or political. The credential is the rentable instrument because the architecture that issues it is self-regulating. The architecture that issues the credential is the architecture that examines its use. When that architecture defaults to non-contestation, the credential is available to whichever party can pay, in money, in convenience, in institutional self-interest, for its use.
Section 4. The structural argument. Why this is laundering, not failure.
A standard reading of the 4 episodes is one of professional failure. Organized medicine got tobacco wrong, then got opioids wrong, then has been slow on systemic racism in healthcare, then has handled COVID badly. This case argues the 4-episode pattern is too consistent to be characterized as failure. The structural property, that the credential is available to parties whose interest is operational, commercial, or political, is what the architecture produces. It is not a deviation from what the architecture is for. It is one of the things the architecture is for.
Apply the vocabulary.
Placement. The original transaction. Tobacco money entering JAMA's advertising pages. Purdue funding paying for the CME and key opinion leader system that would carry the Porter and JIC citation chain. Provincial government health funding sustaining the operational practice of provincial health authorities. Provincial chief medical officers of health serving as the public face of mask mandate withdrawal in 2023. In each case, an interest external to the patient's interest is placed into the credentialed system.
Layering.
Journal to citation to textbook to CME to prescribing physician in the opioid case. Medical school to residency to license to college to hospital policy in the Indigenous health case. Chief Medical Officer to Canadian Medical Association to college to health authority to frontline clinical policy in the COVID case. The interest is moved through layers of credentialed institutions, each of which adds the appearance of medical legitimacy without examining the original transaction.
Integration.
The prescribing physician at the end of the chain who tells the patient the OxyContin is safe because the literature supports it. The security guard at the Regina General Hospital ER who removes Samuel Uko under the operational authority of the hospital. The frontline clinician in 2025 who does not mask because the hospital's policy does not require it. The transaction is now integrated into ordinary clinical conduct. It is no longer recognizable as a transaction at all. It is just medicine. The integration step is the part that makes the structural property invisible.
Section 5. Why it persists. The forcing functions and their absence.
The variation between the 4 episodes maps to variation in available forcing functions. The Surgeon General's 1964 report was a forcing function for tobacco that organized medicine did not produce. The overdose mortality data of the 2000s and 2010s was a forcing function for opioids that organized medicine did not produce. Joyce Echequan's live stream was a forcing function for the Quebec inquest into her death that the architecture would not have produced on its own. For COVID in Canadian healthcare since 2023, no equivalent forcing function has so far arrived. The harm is dispersed across millions of patient encounters. The immunocompromised population is small enough to be politically discounted. There is no single video.
The structural reading.
Where the forcing function is absent, the credentialed architecture defaults to whichever position is operationally easiest for the institutions that hold the credential. Tobacco was easy because the journals wanted the advertising revenue. Opioids were easy because the pharmaceutical-funded CME system was the path of least resistance for continuing medical education. The treatment of Indigenous and Black patients in Canadian healthcare is easy because the alternative, substantive accountability at the level of the license, would require provincial colleges to act against the operational interest of provincial health authorities, which are funded by the same provincial governments to which the colleges are accountable. COVID masking in healthcare is easy because the alternative imposes ongoing operational costs on the institutions that hold the credential.
And the forcing function, when it arrives?
In every case examined here, external to the profession's regulatory architecture. The Surgeon General was a federal government health officer, not the AMA. The overdose data was the CDC and external investigative journalism, not the American Pain Society. Joyce Echequan's video was a patient, not a medical regulator. The case against the COVID position in Canadian healthcare is being made by disabled and immunocompromised patient advocates and by a small minority of dissenting clinicians, not by the colleges or the Canadian Medical Association. In none of the 4 episodes did the profession's regulatory architecture produce the forcing function that broke its own default.
Section 6. Prior work. This argument is not new.
The structural critique of organized medicine as a credential laundering apparatus has been made before, most fully by historians of medicine, by Indigenous health scholars, and by disability rights and patient advocacy communities working in real time on the COVID episode.
On tobacco.
Robert N. Proctor, Golden Holocaust, Origins of the Cigarette Catastrophe and the Case for Abolition, University of California Press, 2011. Proctor's framework, the manufacture of agnotology, the production of ignorance as a strategic asset, is foundational to any structural reading of the medical credential question. Robert K. Jackler and the Stanford Research into the Impact of Tobacco Advertising Collection. The Canonical Primary Source Archive for Episode 1.
On opioids.
Pamela T. M. Leung and colleagues, a 1980 letter on the risk of opioid addiction, New England Journal of Medicine, 2017. The published reckoning, within the journal, that had carried the original letter with what the citation chain had been used to do. Anna Lemke, drug dealer, MD, how doctors were duped, patients got hooked, and why it's so hard to stop, Johns Hopkins, 2016. The clinical side reckoning with the prescribing profession's role.
On Indigenous and Black patients in Canadian healthcare.
The Brian Sinclair Working Group and Mary Jane McCallum and Adele Perry's Structures of Indifference, University of Manitoba Press, 2018. Shireen Razak's Dying from Improvement, Inquests and Inquiries into Indigenous Deaths in Custody, University of Toronto Press, 2015. Yvonne Boyer and Judith Bartlett's 2017. External Review on Tubal Ligation in the Saskatoon Health Region, the principal documentary basis for the coerced sterilization component of Episode 3, and Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon's In Plain Sight, Government of British Columbia, 2020, the principal independent investigation framing Indigenous-specific racism in Canadian healthcare as a structural feature.
On COVID.
Nili Kaplan-Mirth, Breaking Canadians, Healthcare, Advocacy, and the Toll of COVID-19, University of Toronto Press, 2024. A first-person clinical account of advocating for COVID protections within the Canadian medical regulatory architecture, and the COVID-19 disability and immunocompromised advocacy communities working through patient-led organizations, individual testimony, and a sustained body of public writing that has, since 2023, been the principal Canadian voice documenting Episode 4 as it has unfolded. The substantive work is being done in real time by the people most affected. The Laundering's contribution in this case is not the documentation of any single episode. The contribution is the 4-episode comparison, placing the 4 alongside each other and asking what their consistency tells us about the credential as an instrument.
Section 7. Close. What is this case and what is it not? This is not an accusation against the medical profession as a whole,
Against any single physician, college, journal, health authority, or chief medical officer of health. The vast majority of clinical encounters in any of the 4 episodes periods were ordinary clinical encounters in which clinicians did the work their training prepared them to do for patients who received the care they needed. The conduct of named individuals is not the subject. The architecture is.
What has the architecture done?
Over approximately 90 years, lent its credentialed authority to 4 things. To a tobacco advertising campaign whose product killed millions, run inside the pages of its own most prestigious journals, while the same journals were publishing the research that established the product's harm. To an opioid prescribing standard derived from a 5-sentence letter propagated through its own CME and consensus statement apparatus in a way that contributed to a continental overdose crisis that has killed hundreds of thousands of people.
And the Canadian episodes.
To the operational continuation of a Canadian healthcare system that has, on its own subsequent admissions, failed Indigenous and Black patients in named ways. Coerced sterilization of Indigenous women, the ER neglect of an Anishinaabe man, racially motivated mockery during the dying care of an Atikamekw woman, and the forcible removal from the ER of a Black man in mental health crisis. Without provincial colleges acting at the level of the license to recognize racism as contributing factor in any of the named deaths examined in Case 09. And to the withdrawal of universal masking protections in Canadian healthcare settings during a respiratory pandemic in which transmission has not stopped. Hospital-acquired infection has continued to be documented. Immunocompromised patients have continued to report being unable to access care safely, and the airborne transmission science has been settled for years.
The 4 episodes are not equivalents.
No, they differ in scale, in mechanism, in the population harmed, and in the role any single named clinician played. They are united by the structural property that the credentialed architecture defaulted in each to a position the available evidence did not fully support, and that the correction, when it came from outside the architecture, or, in the case of episodes 3 and 4, has not yet come at all. The substantive question for the architecture's funders, Canadian taxpayers, Canadian patients, Canadian voters, and the medical students and residents who will be the next generation of credentialed clinicians, is whether the credential's current regulatory architecture is the architecture they consider adequate.
All right, leave us with a line.
The architecture is, in working order, producing the licenses, the journals, the consensus statements, the college positions, and the chief medical officer endorsements that the country requires it to produce. What it has produced over the 4 episodes examined here is on the record. The next episode is already in progress somewhere.
The instrument is the same.
The instrument is the same.
That brings us to the close of Case 12, The White Coat, from the Laundering, an investigative series on reputation laundering through Canadian institutions. The sources, the prior work citations, and a Section 8 open call to clinicians, patients, families, and historians of medicine are on the page beneath this player. Case 09 is the inquest layer that touches Episode 3. Case 01 is where the structural framework was first laid down. The architecture is the subject. Thank you for listening. Section 8, Open Call. Corrections and additions especially welcomed. From Indigenous and Black patients and families,
Samuel Uko's family in particular. From disabled and immunocompromised patients who have been the front line of Episode 4. from clinicians who have advocated within the colleges for substantive correction, from historians of medicine with primary source access to the journal archives, from medical students and residents.
We acknowledge the limits of where this case is written from.
It is written from outside the medical profession. We have grounded it in the public record and in the published work of authors and communities closer to the substance. Historians of tobacco and opioid policy, Indigenous health scholars and advocacy groups, the BC in Plain Sight investigation, and the disability and immunocompromised advocacy communities currently documenting the COVID episode in real time.
Where the case has overreached or undersized any aspect of the 4 episodes, we will revise.
Where corrections are warranted, they will be made and dated on the page. Where additions are warranted, they will be incorporated. Contact: circuit@felineunion.org. Signal on request. Public document repositories preferred. Confidentiality respected. No paywall, no advertising.